How do you build one of the biggest drug empires in American history, steal over $100 million, and vanish from the face of the earth without leaving a single trace? His name was Frank Matthews. The DEA ranked him one of the top 10 drug traffickers in United States history. By his late 20s, this young black man from North Carolina had built a heroin and cocaine network spanning 21 states, completely independent of the Italian Mafia. His fortune? $300 million. That's roughly $2 billion in today's money. More than Frank Lucas. More than Bumpy Johnson. More than almost anyone you've ever heard of. And yet, almost nobody knows his name. Hollywood never made his movie. Because how do you end a gangster film where the gangster wins? In 1973, the night before he was supposed to stand trial and face life in prison, Frank Matthews took $20 million in cash, grabbed his girlfriend, and disappeared. No goodbye. No body, no trace. The DEA launched the biggest manhunt in their history. They searched 5 continents. They found nothing. Over 50 years later, he is still missing. This is the most intriguing unsolved disappearance in the history of American crime. And it starts in the dusty streets of Durham, North Carolina, with a boy who had nothing. Durham, North Carolina. February the 13th, 1944. A boy comes into the world the way some people leave it, quietly, and with no one watching who mattered. His mother's name is barely a footnote in the records. His father's name isn't in the records at all. What we know is this: before the boy turned 5, his mother was dead, just like that. No long illness the family could prepare for. No drawn-out goodbye. One day she was there, and then she wasn't. And the boy was alone in a way that most children never have to understand. His aunt took him in, raised him as her own, which in those days, and in that part of the South, was not unusual. Families stretched, families absorbed. You didn't let blood go to the state if you had a spare room and a working stove. So the boy grew up in her care, in the poorest ward of Durham, in a narrow house on a narrow street, where the wallpaper peeled and the winters came through the walls like they owned the place. But here is where the story takes its first strange turn. Because Durham, North Carolina, in the 1940s and 1950s, Howie was not what you might expect. Yes, it was segregated. Yes, the laws were brutal and the lines were drawn in blood and concrete. But the black community in Durham had built something extraordinary underneath all of that. The Haiti district, just a short walk from where young Frank Matthews slept each night, was humming with black-owned banks, insurance companies, barbershops, restaurants, a library, a theater. North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance, the largest black-owned business in America, was headquartered right there. Durham had more black millionaires per capita than any city in the state. Some said in the country. Imagine that, a 4-year-old orphan growing up in poverty, but surrounded on every side by proof that people who look like him could build empires. Real ones. Brick and mortar and money in the vault. The atmosphere of that place gave young black people something segregation was designed to crush. The belief that wealth was possible. That power was not just for other people. Frank Matthews absorbed all of it. You can be certain of that. Children watch everything, and fatherless children watch harder, because they are looking for the blueprint that nobody handed them. Al Bradley, an author who studied Frank's early life, put it simply. Matthews must have seen lots of black-owned businesses and successful black men when he was growing up. Sonana that later gave him the audacity to do what no one thought a black man could do in the drug trade. Something in that city planted a seed in that boy. The seed just grew in a direction nobody predicted. What was he like, this child? That depends on who you ask, and good luck getting a straight answer. The people of Durham have been guarding Frank Matthews' memory for over 50 years, and they guard it the way you guard a loaded weapon, carefully and with both hands. When a childhood friend remembers him as strong and charismatic, a born leader, the kind of kid other kids just followed without being asked. He didn't shout, he didn't beg for attention. He walked into a room, and the room rearranged itself around him. Another friend, if you could call anyone Frank's friend, offers a different angle. People brag that they knew Frank, he said, but they didn't really know him. You could never really get close. Even as a boy, he kept a distance. He let you in just far enough to feel special, but never far enough to see what was actually going on behind those eyes. He could be generous. There are stories of that. Small kindnesses, money shared, loyalty offered to the people he chose. But cross him, and the temperature in the room dropped to something Arctic. Another associate from those early days remembers it plainly. Frank was a natural who would fight anybody over anything. Not out of rage, out of principle. And the principle being that no one was ever going to disrespect Frank Matthews and walk away comfortable. School didn't hold him. It never had a chance. Frank was bored by classrooms the way a river's bored by a dam. He was always looking for the crack, the way around, the faster current. What he wanted was the streets, and the streets wanted him back. As one of his childhood friends recalled, even in those days, he was all about money. Frank was a hustler, not the word people use loosely now. You're a hustler in the original sense. Someone who sees every interaction as a transaction and every transaction as a chance to come out ahead. By 14, he was leading a gang of boys his age into petty crimes. His first arrest, and this detail is almost too perfect, was for stealing chickens from a local farm. Chickens? The future drug lord who would amass $300 million and vanish from the face of the earth got his start stealing poultry in North Carolina. If that doesn't tell you something about where he came from and how far he was willing to travel, nothing will. He tried barber school for a while, got caught stealing equipment, lasted a few months before that door closed too. And then sometime in the early 1960s, a neighbor saw him standing on Fayetteville Street, lean, restless, already looking past the horizon. He said he was going to New York to make money. He said it the way other people say they're going to the store. Like it was inevitable. Like it had already happened and he was just catching up to it. And that was the last time Durham really had him. The boy who'd lost his mother at 4, who'd never known his father, who'd grown up watching black men build fortunes in a city that the rest of America tried to forget. That boy stepped onto a northbound road and walked into a future that would make him one of the most powerful criminals this country has ever produced. But Durham never forgot him. Watch, they just stopped talking about him. And if you go there today and ask the old-timers about Frank Matthews, you will see something cross their faces. A flicker, quick as a blink, that is equal parts pride and fear. Because as one resident put it, with the kind of quiet that says more than shouting ever could, people here are cautious. Many think Frank Matthews is still alive. You never know who's listening. There is a particular kind of restlessness that settles into certain children the way rust settles into iron, slowly at first, then all at once, until it becomes the only thing holding the shape together. Frank Matthews had it before he could name it. School was not the answer. School was a room full of people talking about things that had nothing to do with the question burning through his chest, which was simple and brutal and older than any textbook. How do I stop being poor? His teacher saw a boy who lacked seriousness. What they were actually looking at was a boy who had already decided that the world they were preparing him for was not the world he intended to live in. He sat through lessons the way a passenger sits through a delay at a bus station, present in body, already gone in every way that mattered. What he preferred was the street, the noise and negotiation of it, the way money moved from hand to hand out there, fast and real and immediate. That was a classroom Frank Matthews respected. He dropped out early. Nobody was surprised. The streets had been pulling at him for years, and by the time he was 14, he had stopped pretending they weren't. He gathered a small gang of boys around him, not through threats, not through violence, but through that strange magnetic quality he'd always had. The boys followed because following Frank felt like being close to something that was going somewhere. They didn't know where yet, which neither did he, but the direction was up, and that was enough. Together they ran small crimes, petty stuff, nickel and dime hustles that barely registered with the law. And then there was the chicken incident, Frank's first arrest at 14 years old for stealing chickens from a local farm. It's the kind of detail that sounds like someone made it up, a fable from the early life of a folk hero. The boy who would one day control a $300 million narcotics empire, who would outmaneuver the Italian Mafia, who would vanish with more cash than most nations keep in reserve. That boy's criminal origin story begins with poultry. There's something almost comic about it, but if you listen closely, the comedy has teeth, Because what the chicken theft really tells you is that Frank Matthews was willing to take what he wanted, consequences be damned, from the very beginning. The scale would change. The instinct never did. After the arrest, someone, his aunt perhaps, or a neighbor who still believed the boy could be saved, steered him toward barber school. It was a practical choice. Barbering was honest work, respected in the black community, a trade that could feed a family. Durham had barbershops on every corner, places where men gathered to talk and argue and make sense of a world that didn't make much sense. Frank enrolled. He learned to cut hair. He was good at it, by most accounts. Steady hands, easy conversation. It's the kind of presence that made people comfortable in his chair. He lasted a few months. Then he got caught stealing the equipment. Think about that for a moment. He wasn't stealing money. He wasn't stealing drugs. He was stealing clippers, combs, shears, the tools of a legitimate trade, as if some part of him knew he would need the skill, but had no intention of earning the instruments honestly. And as if the hustle was already so deep in his bones that even the path toward respectability had to be walked crooked. Barber school closed its doors to him, and with it closed the last plausible detour between Frank Matthews and the life he was always going to live. There was nothing left in Durham for him now. No school, no trade, no parents, just an aunt who loved him and a city that had shown him what black wealth looked like without giving him a single legitimate route to reach it. And then came the moment that everyone in Durham remembers differently, but no one disputes happened. A neighbor saw him standing on Fayetteville Street, thin, coiled, vibrating with the kind of energy that young men carry when they have made a decision they cannot take back. He said he was going to New York to make money. He said it flat. No bravado, no theater, just a statement of fact delivered to the open air, as if the universe needed to be notified. He didn't go to New York, not yet. He went to Philadelphia first, which was the smart play. A mid-sized city with a thriving underground economy, close enough to New York to smell it, but far enough away to make your mistakes in relative obscurity. Frank found work cutting hair during the day, which kept food on the table and a roof overhead. But the real education happened after hours. He fell in with a numbers game racket, an illegal gambling operation that was, in those years, one of the primary engines of the black underground economy across the eastern seaboard. Running numbers taught Frank things no barber school ever could: how to manage risk, how to read people, how to move money through systems that didn't exist on paper. He met other young men like himself, ambitious, impatient, hungry in a way that polite society couldn't feed. He stayed in Philadelphia for about a year, long enough to sharpen himself, long enough to understand that the underground economy was not a collection of random hustles, but a system with hierarchies, supply chains, territories, and rules that could be learned and eventually mastered. And long enough to know that Philadelphia was not the stage he was built for. Sometime in 1963, or maybe 1964, the records are thin and the memories are thinner, Frank Matthews left Philadelphia and headed northeast, to Brooklyn, to the city that swallowed men whole and occasionally, very occasionally, made them into kings. He arrived with a barber's license he'd half stolen his way into, a year's worth of street education, and absolutely nothing else. No connections, no money, no family waiting. Just a young man from the poorest ward of a North Carolina tobacco town, stepping off a bus into the roar of New York City, carrying nothing but the unshakable belief that he was going to be somebody. Brooklyn did not know it yet, but it was about to rearrange itself around Frank Matthews the same way those boys back in Durham had. Instinctively, inevitably, and without quite understanding why. For a while, Brooklyn looked like it might be enough. Frank Matthews set up his barber's chair, found his regulars, kept his hands busy and his ears open. On the side, he ran a small gambling operation, numbers, the same illegal lottery racket he'd learned in Philadelphia. It was steady income. It was safe. And it bored him the way oxygen bores a fire, because the real money was not in barbershops or number slips. The real money was in the powder that was eating New York alive. To understand what Frank Matthews walked into, you have to understand what heroin did to this city in the late 1960s. It did not creep in. It crashed through the door like a battering ram and stayed. Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant, she to the South Bronx, entire neighborhoods turned into open-air markets where you could buy a bag of dope faster than you could buy a loaf of bread. The drug hollowed out families the way termites hollow out wood, silently, relentlessly, until the structure collapsed and everyone inside went with it. In the year after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, New York recorded more than 2,000 homicides. A former police officer who worked Harlem in those years remembered it plainly. The majority of them were in Harlem, and about 85% were drug-related. It got so bad that if a cop gave someone a summons for double parking, it could easily have led to a small-scale riot. That's how close to the edge the city was. And in the middle of all that destruction, drug dealers became folk heroes. Not because the community was blind to what they were doing, but because the system had failed so completely that the men breaking it looked more powerful than the men running it. Dealers like Nicky Barnes walked the streets of Harlem in fur coats and were treated like visiting royalty. The logic was cruel but human. If the government won't protect you, you start admiring whoever has the power to protect themselves. Frank Matthews saw all of this with the eyes of a man who had been studying power his whole life. He saw the money. He saw the demand. He saw the gap between what was possible and what he was currently doing with a pair of clippers and a deck of number slips. And one morning, Police Inspector Roger Juray would later describe it this way: Frank woke up and decided to hang up the barber's white jacket. Frank said to himself, "I'm going to be the dude who wears the $300 silk suits and drives a Lincoln." But wanting in and getting in were two very different things. In the 1960s, in the drug trade on the East Coast was not a free market. It was a monopoly, and the monopoly belonged to La Cosa Nostra, the five families of the New York Mafia, the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Bonanos, the Genovese's, the Colombos. They controlled the supply, they controlled the distribution, and they controlled who was allowed to sell and who was not. If you were black and you wanted to deal heroin in New York, you did it under their roof, on their terms, at their prices. There was no door number two. Frank Matthews knocked on door number one. He approached the Gambino family. They turned him down. He went to the Bonanos. Same answer. Two of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet looked at this young black man from North Carolina and decided he was not worth their time. Now, most hustlers, upon being rejected by the Italian Mafia, would have done the sensible thing. Found a crew, found a corner, went and sold whatever they could get their hands on at whatever price they were given. Most hustlers understood that the system was the system, and you worked within it or you didn't work at all. Frank Matthews was not most hustlers. The rejection did not discourage him. It redirected him. If the front door was locked, he would find a window on the other side of the world. The window came through a man named Spanish Raymond Marquez. Marquez was well known in Harlem as the king of the underground lottery, a numbers boss with connections that stretched far beyond the city. Through Marquez, Frank was introduced to a Cuban gangster named Rolando Gonzalez Nunes. Gonzalez was not a small-time operator. In the 1960s, he was one of the biggest cocaine suppliers in New York before fleeing to Venezuela, ahead of a federal indictment. He had the product, he had the pipeline, and he was willing to do business with a young man the Italians had dismissed. Frank bought his first kilogram of cocaine for $20,000. It was the most important purchase in the history of American organized crime that nobody talks about, because that single transaction cracked open a pipeline that would reshape the drug trade entirely. Here is how it worked, and the scale of it still stuns historians today. Opium was cultivated in the poppy fields of Turkey. It was shipped to clandestine laboratories in Marseille, France, where Corsican chemists refined it into pure heroin. From France, the product moved to Venezuela, a strategic transit point where the Corsican networks had deep connections with corrupt government officials. In Venezuela, Cuban traffickers like Gonzalez took over distribution, shipping heroin and cocaine north into the United States through Miami and other entry points. This was the French Connection, one of the most sophisticated drug smuggling networks the world had ever seen. And Frank Matthews, the orphan from Durham who'd been cutting hair in Brooklyn 6 months earlier, had just plugged himself directly into it. Not as a middleman, not as a street-level dealer buying scraps from the mafia at inflated prices. He had secured his own source, his own supply chain, his own seat at a table that the Italian-American Mafia believed belonged exclusively to them. The product was pure, the prices were fair, and the demand was bottomless. Within a single year of that first $20,000 purchase, Frank Matthews had become one of the biggest drug dealers in New York City. He was barely 25 years old. What he had done was, by any measure, extraordinary. A young black man with no family connections, no inherited network, no mafia sponsorship, and no formal education had built an independent supply line from the poppy fields of Asia Minor to the street corners of Brooklyn. He had done what La Cosa Nostra told him he could not do. He had done what the entire structure of American organized crime was designed to prevent, and he was only getting started. Let's talk numbers for a moment. Not because numbers are the most interesting part of this story, but because in Frank Matthews' case, the numbers are so large they stop sounding real. And when the truth stops sounding real, you know you're dealing with someone who has broken through a ceiling that wasn't supposed to break. $600,000. That's what Frank Matthews was earning per day at the height of his operation. Not per month, not per quarter, per day. To put that in perspective, the average American household in 1972 earned roughly $10,000 in an entire year. Frank was making 60 times that before lunch. His total fortune was estimated at $300 million, a figure that, adjusted for inflation, balloons to nearly $2 billion in today's money. He was, by any honest measure, one of the wealthiest criminals in American history, and he was not yet 30 years old. But it wasn't just the money. Money was the scoreboard. What made Frank Matthews different, what separated him from every other drug dealer stacking cash in a Brooklyn closet, was the architecture of the thing he built. His network had expanded from New York into 21 states, primarily along the eastern seaboard, but reaching deep into the South and Midwest. He was no longer just a dealer. He was a distributor, a wholesaler. He supplied other dealers, top-tier operators in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, Atlanta, and Miami, with heroin and cocaine at prices and purity levels that the Italian Mafia simply could not match. Where La Cosa Nostra sold diluted product at extortionate prices because they could, because the monopoly allowed it, Matthews offered something revolutionary, quality at a fair rate. He paid premium prices to his Corsican and Cuban suppliers to guarantee purity, and he passed that advantage downstream. In the language of legitimate business, he was disrupting the market. In the language of the streets, he was eating the mob's lunch, and they couldn't do a thing about it. Liddy Jones, a former associate, remembered it with something close to amazement. No gangster in New York at the time earned more money than him, Jones said. The Italian Mafia made a lot of money, but they couldn't touch Frank. He had more money than the mob. Jones also recalled, with a kind of bewildered admiration, making a deal with Matthews in the early 70s. It was amazing, he said. Frank never really counted the money. You could have shorted him thousands of dollars and he wouldn't have known. Wham, that's not carelessness. That's a man operating at a scale where thousands of dollars no longer register as meaningful. And then Frank Matthews did something that elevated him from drug lord to something closer to a statesman of the underworld. In October of 1971, he organized a summit. Not a meeting in a back room, a summit. He invited the biggest African-American and Hispanic drug traffickers in the United States to Atlanta, Georgia, and to sit down together and discuss how to improve the distribution of heroin and cocaine across the country. Think about that. A 27-year-old black man from Durham, North Carolina, sent out invitations to the most powerful and dangerous criminals of color in America, and they came. They came because Frank Matthews was the reason to come. He had the connections, he had the supply, he had the credibility. When he had built something so large and so independent that other kingpins looked at him and saw not a rival, but a model. The following year, he did it again. This time in Las Vegas during the Muhammad Ali Jerry Quarry fight, a spectacle that drew thousands and provided perfect cover for a gathering of men who did not want to be noticed. The agenda was even more ambitious than Atlanta. Matthews and the assembled bosses discussed establishing stronger, fully independent relationships with the Corsican and Cuban suppliers, cutting the Italian-American Mafia out of the equation entirely, not nibbling at the edges of their control, eliminating it, When anti-narcotics agents began checking the license plates in the parking lot and cross-referencing the intelligence on who was in attendance, they realized what they were looking at. One agent recalled the moment. "We could see it was a meeting of the who's who of black organized crime. Yes, Matthews was the reason they came. At the time, he really was the country's biggest black kingpin. It was only after Las Vegas that the federal authorities began to take Frank Matthews seriously, which, if you stop and think about it, is staggering. Here was a man who had been running a narcotics empire across 21 states, generating hundreds of millions of dollars, operating completely outside the mafia structure, and in 1970, and his name did not appear on a single major criminal violators list kept by any American law enforcement agency. He was, in their files, a non-entity. He had built the largest black-run drug operation in the history of the United States, and the people whose job it was to know about it simply didn't. Federal prosecutor William Callahan, who would later lead the case against Matthews, was blunt about what could have been. If Matthews hadn't been clipped, he said, he would have eventually dominated the national scene, and then he would have become a truly international kingpin. I think Matthews was so ambitious that could have been his ultimate goal. Other investigators went further. They compared him to Lucky Luciano, the man who organized the American Mafia itself. They compared him to Pablo Escobar, the Colombian cocaine king who would reshape global crime a decade later. These were not casual comparisons. These were men who had spent their careers studying organized crime, telling the world that Frank Matthews belonged in the conversation with the most consequential criminals who ever lived. He was 27 years old. He had started with nothing. No father, no mother, no money, no connections. 4 years earlier, he had been cutting hair in a Brooklyn barbershop. Now he was convening summits of kingpins, who commanding a supply chain that stretched from the poppy fields of Turkey to the street corners of 21 American states, and generating wealth that dwarfed some of the mafia families that had been operating for half a century. It was, by any standard, one of the most remarkable criminal achievements in modern history. And like all empires built by extraordinary men who believe they cannot be touched, it carried within it the seeds of its own spectacular unraveling. There is a photograph of Frank Matthews that people who knew him say captures the man perfectly. He is wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most Americans earned in a week. There is a cigar in his hand, or maybe in his mouth. The details shift depending on who is telling the story. His posture says everything. Shoulders back, chin slightly raised, the stance of a man who has walked into a room he owns and is waiting for everyone else to figure that out. He looks like money. He looks like power. He looks like someone who has beaten every odd the world ever stacked against him. But photographs are liars. They show you the surface and let you fill in the rest with whatever you want to believe. And in 1972, the surface of Frank Matthews' life was so dazzling that almost nobody, not the people around him, not the men who worked for him, and certainly not the law enforcement agencies that still barely knew his name, could see what was rotting underneath. Where the transformation had happened gradually, the way all transformations do when you're living inside them. Rick Thalley, a former New York drug dealer who knew Frank in the late 60s, remembered the early days clearly. In those days, Matthews did not really stick out in the crowd, Thalley said. The way he was dressed, the way he talked, Frank looked and moved more like a country kid from North Carolina than a polished gangster. That was the Frank who cut hair in Brooklyn, who wore plain clothes and drove nothing special and kept his mouth shut in rooms full of louder men. That Frank was gone now. In his place stood someone the country kid from Durham would not have recognized. The suits came first, $300 apiece, silk, tailored, immaculate. Then the cars, not one car, a fleet. Lincolns, Cadillacs, the kind of vehicles that announced your arrival before you opened the door. Then the women, plural, beautiful, draped around him like accessories. And then the cigars and the cash rolls and the way he carried himself through Brooklyn and Harlem like a visiting head of state making the rounds of a grateful nation. And then came Todd Hill. To understand what it meant for Frank Matthews to buy a mansion on Todd Hill, you have to understand Todd Hill itself. It was and still is the wealthiest neighborhood on Staten Island and one of the most exclusive in all of New York City. In the early 1970s, it was also, quietly, were the residential district of choice for some of the most powerful mafia figures in the country. Big Paul Castellano, who would later become the godfather of the Gambino family, had his estate there. Members of the Lucchese family lived nearby. It was a neighborhood of iron gates and long driveways and the kind of silence that only real money can buy. And into this world walked Frank Matthews, the only black man on the hill, not a guest, not a servant, a homeowner, living directly across the street from the future boss of the Gambinos. In the Matthews era, the only black people you could see in Todd Hill were the hired help. Even today, black residents make up barely 1% of the population. Frank didn't just buy a house in the wrong neighborhood. He planted a flag in enemy territory and dared anyone to pull it out. It was audacious, it was magnificent, and it was profoundly, catastrophically stupid. Because while Frank was playing king, the king was developing a habit that no amount of money could manage. Cocaine, not the occasional line at a party, not recreational use that stays in its lane. Frank Matthews was using heavily, daily, in quantities that were rewriting the chemistry of his brain in real time. Author Donald Goddard, who studied Frank's life in detail, described what was happening by the autumn of 1972 in clinical terms. Matthews showed the classic symptoms of chronic cocaine abuse, is shuffling between extremes of euphoria and irritability. Anyone who has watched addiction take hold of someone they know will recognize the pattern. The highs get higher and shorter. The lows get deeper and longer. The space between them narrows until there is no baseline left. Just a man ricocheting between feeling invincible and feeling hunted, with nothing in between. It showed in his work. The drug deals that had once been handled with precision and calm started to fray. Hard, irrational decisions, erratic behavior. The kind of mistakes that, in his line of business, could get you killed or caught, and it didn't matter which came first because the result was the same. Federal prosecutor William Callahan, who was building the case against Matthews, learned something else during the investigation. Frank had developed a rapid, irregular heartbeat. His body was telling him, in the only language a body knows, that what he was doing was not sustainable. He ignored it. No, of course he did. That is what addiction does. It replaces the voice in your head that says stop with a louder voice that says more. And through it all, the money kept coming. $600,000 a day does not stop flowing because the man collecting it can't sleep, or because his hands shake at 4 a.m, or because his heart skips beats that hearts are not supposed to skip. The empire ran on its own momentum now. A machine so large that it kept producing even as the man who built it was slowly dismantling himself from the inside out. Las Vegas made it worse. Frank loved Vegas the way addicts love anything that offers a bigger hit. He flew there regularly to gamble, to party, and to launder money. Duffel bags full of cash handed directly to casino cashiers, who took 15 to 18% as their cut and returned the rest clean. To prosecutor Callahan would later describe the scene with a kind of astonished detachment. We heard Frank would take duffel bags full of cash to a casino and give them to a cashier. Clean money out, dirty money in, and the house always got its share. It was elegant in its simplicity. It was also the behavior of a man who had stopped caring about invisibility, who had traded the discipline that built his empire for the recklessness that would bring the wolves to his door. Because the wolves were already gathering, and Frank Matthews, high on his own supply, living in a mansion across the street from the mafia, laundering millions in plain sight in the most surveilled city in the desert, Frank Matthews could not see them, or maybe he could, and the cocaine told him they didn't matter. Either way, the floor beneath his feet had already begun to crack. He just hadn't fallen through yet. 1972. The year everything started closing in. Not from one direction, from all of them, simultaneously, like walls in a room that someone is shrinking on purpose. Start with the men across the street. Paul Castellano did not appreciate Frank Matthews. That is putting it with a gentleness the situation did not possess. Castellano was old-school Cosa Nostra, a man who believed in hierarchies carved in stone and enforced with bullets. And here was this young black drug dealer, not only operating outside the mafia's control, so not only making more money than half the families on the commission, but living on Todd Hill, in Castellano's neighborhood, across the street from Castellano's home, sleeping in a bed that, in Big Paul's estimation, belonged to the kind of person who would never sleep there. The insult was not symbolic, it was architectural, it was personal, and according to police who had Castellano under telephone surveillance, he wanted Frank Matthews eliminated. The mob sent a delegation, and not a hit squad, not yet, but a message. A group of men paid Frank a visit and informed him, with the particular politeness that the mafia uses when it is threatening to kill you, that he was out of his league. It was a warning dressed in a handshake. Take a step back. Know your place. Remember who runs this city and who is merely renting space in it. Frank Matthews listened to the delegation, and then he did something that, even by his own reckless standards, was insane. One of the Genovese family's associates had ripped him off in a drug deal, a business dispute, the kind of thing that, in organized crime, is typically settled through negotiation, compensation, or quiet violence within understood boundaries. Matthews did not negotiate. He did not accept a loss. He kidnapped the man, snatched an associate of one of the 5 most powerful mafia families in America off the street, and then held him in retaliation. Try to absorb that for a moment. In 1972, kidnapping a made man's associate was not a business move. It was a declaration of war against an organization that had been killing people professionally since before Frank Matthews was born. It could have ended his life that same week. The fact that it didn't is either a testament to Matthews' reputation, the mob may have feared the disruption a war with him would cause to the drug supply chain, or proof that cocaine had disconnected him so completely from rational thinking that he no longer understood the rules of the world he was living in. Possibly both. But the mafia was only one wall. The second wall was called Group 12, and it had been built specifically to destroy Frank Matthews. Here is how federal drug investigations worked in the early 1970s, because it matters for understanding what happened next and what didn't. There was no single unified drug enforcement agency in the United States until the DEA was created in 1973. Before that, the work was fragmented across multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions, competing budgets, and institutional egos that sometimes did more to protect criminals than catch them. Well, building a conspiracy case against a major drug trafficker required coordination between federal prosecutors, narcotics agents, the IRS, and sometimes Interpol, each with their own priorities, their own timelines, and their own bureaucratic inertia. It was, in practical terms, like trying to build a house while the architects argued about the blueprints. Group 12 was assembled in 1972 with a specific mandate: investigate Frank Matthews and build a case strong enough to indict. And the unit was led by federal prosecutor William Callahan, whose job was to coordinate the legal strategy, and Gerard Miller, a DEA veteran with 2 decades of experience in organized crime. Together, they assembled what resources they could, and the resources were thin. They had 3 months to produce something significant, 3 months to penetrate an operation that had been running unchecked for years, built by a man who had never appeared on a single law enforcement list. It was, by any measure, not enough time. To do it properly would have taken years. They started with wiretaps. Matthews' telephone calls were now being recorded, transcribed, and analyzed. They began identifying and seizing real estate and other assets, tangible proof that Frank had money he couldn't explain. In 1972, the U.S. anti-narcotics authorities lent additional support, followed by Interpol and the IRS, building a web of surveillance around a man who, until recently, had been invisible. Then they tried to follow him. This did not go well. Whenever agents tailed Matthews' car, he lost them. Every time. He blew through red lights, made illegal turns, drove like a man who either didn't know he was being followed or didn't care, or, and this is the darker possibility, like a man who knew exactly when the tail was coming because someone inside the NYPD was telling him. Corruption in the New York Police Department in the early 1970s was not a rumor. It was a documented epidemic. The Knapp Commission had just finished exposing systemic graft and bribery that reached into every precinct in the city. Whether Matthews had a cop on his payroll, the investigators could never prove. But the pattern was difficult to explain any other way. Gerard Miller would later say, with a frustration you can still hear through the decades, Frank was ahead of us from the beginning. One detail from the investigation still makes agents shake their heads. Frank Matthews once opened the trunk of his car in broad daylight, took out kilograms of drugs, and handed them to an individual in full view of the street, in full view of anyone who might be watching, including, presumably, the very agents who were trying to build a case against him. As if the surveillance meant nothing, as if the law itself was an inconvenience too small to acknowledge. But the investigation ground forward anyway, so because that is what investigations do when they have enough bodies and enough time, even barely enough. The arrest started, not Matthews himself, not yet, but the people around him, associates, distributors, lieutenants in his network. One by one, they were picked up on charges that Group 12 had assembled from wiretaps and financial records. And some of them, facing years behind bars, did what people facing years behind bars have always done. They talked. Each conversation gave the investigators a little more. A name, a route, a shipment date, a property they hadn't known about. The picture of Frank Matthews' empire assembled itself piece by piece, not through a single dramatic breakthrough, but through the slow, grinding accumulation of small betrayals. The tongues loosened one at a time, and with each one the case grew heavier. Yet after a year of this, a year of wiretaps and car chases and arrested associates in interrogation rooms, Group 12 had what it needed. Solid evidence that Frank Larry Matthews was running a multi-state drug trafficking conspiracy. Evidence that could survive a courtroom. Evidence that could put him away for life. All that remained was to put handcuffs on the man himself, and that, as it turned out, was the easy part. Keeping them on would be something else entirely. January 5th, 1973, 11 o'clock in the morning. Las Vegas International Airport. The terminal is busy the way Las Vegas terminals always are. A current of tourists, gamblers, honeymooners, and businessmen flowing through the concourse in that particular American shuffle of people going somewhere they believe will be better than where they are. Somewhere in that current, walking toward a gate for a flight to Los Angeles, is Frank Matthews. His girlfriend is beside him. He is dressed well. Because Frank Matthews is always dressed well. He does not look nervous. He does not look like a man who knows what is about to happen. The federal agents step in front of him the way a wall steps in front of a hallway. Badges out, handcuffs produced. The charges read aloud in the flat, bureaucratic cadence that law enforcement uses when it wants you to understand that the words are not a conversation. They are a fact. Tax fraud and conspiracy to traffic 18 kilograms of cocaine. 18 kilos, an amount with an estimated street value between $1 and $4.5 million. A fraction of what Frank moved in a single week, but enough, on paper, in a courtroom, under oath, to end his life as a free man. Frank did not resist. He went quietly, which is its own kind of statement. A man who fights at the moment of arrest is a man who has been caught off guard. A man who goes quietly is a man who has already begun calculating the next move. The bail hearing was held the following day. And this is where you need to pay attention, because what happened in that courtroom is the hinge on which the next 50 years of mystery will turn. Prosecutor William Callahan was there. He stood face to face with Frank Matthews, the man his team had spent a year chasing through wiretaps and financial records, and the slowly loosening tongues of arrested associates. Callahan would later recall the encounter with a clarity that suggests it never left him. "We were literally face to face," he said. "He told us that we had nothing on him and that he would be out in no time." Think about that. A man staring at a federal conspiracy charge facing a team of prosecutors who had built their case brick by brick over 12 months, and his response is not fear, not negotiation, not even silence. It is contempt. Pure, unbothered contempt. As if the entire apparatus of American justice was a minor inconvenience he would handle between lunch and dinner. The magistrate, at least, took the situation seriously. Bail was set at $5 million. $5 million. It was the highest bail amount in the history of the United States at that time. A number chosen not because the court was being punitive, but because the court understood two things about Frank Matthews that the bail system was not designed to account for simultaneously. He had the means to run, and he had every reason to. And then the system did what systems do when they are governed by rules that were written for ordinary people and applied to extraordinary ones. It failed. The first reduction came quickly. Matthews' legal team argued. Motions were filed. Agreements were offered. Frank agreed not to contest his extradition to New York, and in exchange, bail was cut to $2.5 million. Still a large number. Still, theoretically, a leash. But the leash was already loosening. Then it dropped again to $325,000. Let that number sit for a moment. $325,000 for a man whose fortune was estimated at $300 million. That is not bail. That is a rounding error. It is the equivalent of asking a billionaire to leave a $100 deposit and promising to come back for sentencing. The court had looked at the most flight-prone, most well-funded, most resourceful drug lord in the country and decided that a sum he could pull from a dresser drawer was sufficient to guarantee his return. He paid it the way you pay for a cup of coffee. He walked out. And the men who had spent a year building the cage watched the door close behind him with the animal on the wrong side of the bars. What followed was 6 months of waiting, 6 months during which Frank Matthews was a free man, technically on bail, technically required to appear in court, technically still under the jurisdiction of a legal system that had just demonstrated in the most spectacular way possible that it could not hold him. The investigators knew the danger. They were not fools. But knowing the danger and being able to do anything about it are two very different things. Inspector Roger Garay, who had been part of the surveillance effort, would later testify with the weary honesty of a man describing a disaster he saw coming but could not prevent. We couldn't keep tabs on Matthews. We were stretched thin and simply didn't have the manpower to watch him 24/7. All we could do was hope and pray he would keep showing up in court. Hope. That was the federal government's strategy for containing a man who had built a 21-state drug empire from nothing, who had outsmarted the Italian Mafia, who had evaded surveillance for years, who had the resources to disappear to any country on earth. Hope and prayer. Meanwhile, the world around Frank Matthews was changing in ways that made staying even less attractive than it already was. And the French connection, the Corsican pipeline that had supplied him with heroin through Venezuela and Cuba, was being systematically dismantled by international law enforcement. His supply lines were fraying, his associates were in custody or cooperating with the government. The empire that had once seemed invincible was bleeding out from 100 wounds, and the trial waiting for him at the end of those 6 months carried a sentence that would ensure he never walked free again. Life. Not a decade, not 20 years. Life. So consider the math as Frank Matthews must have considered it. On one side of the ledger, a courtroom, a life sentence, a broken empire, and a supply chain that no longer existed. On the other side, an estimated $20 million in laundered cash, a network of international contacts, a passport, and a woman who would go with him. It was not really a choice at all. It was an equation, and Frank Matthews had always been good with numbers. When the trial was scheduled for July, the prosecutors prepared their case. The judge reserved the courtroom. The investigators held their breath and counted the days. Frank Matthews counted too, but he was counting something different. July 2nd, 1973. The courtroom was ready. The fluorescent lights were on. The stenographer had her fingers resting above the keys. The prosecution team, the men and women who had spent 12 months assembling wiretap transcripts, financial records, and the testimony of turned associates into a case they believed was airtight, sat at their table with their files arranged and their arguments rehearsed. The judge was on the bench. The clock was running. All that was missing was the defendant. Frank Larry Matthews was supposed to walk through those doors that morning. He was supposed to sit down at the defense table, face the charges read against him, and begin the process by which the United States government would take away the rest of his life. That was the plan. That was the arrangement. That was the deal struck when a man posts $325,000 in bail and promises, under the weight of the American legal system, to return. He did not come. He would never come. Somewhere in the small hours before dawn, while the prosecutors slept, while the judge's courtroom sat dark and locked, while the city of New York hummed along in the half-conscious rhythm that cities keep between midnight and morning, Frank Matthews had made his final moves. He said goodbye. not to everyone, not to his ex-wife Barbara, who would learn of his disappearance the way the rest of the world did, after the fact, with no warning and no explanation. Not to his 3 sons, who would grow up without a father for the second time in the Matthews family line. He said goodbye to the people he chose, or in the way he chose, on a timeline only he controlled. He gave away portions of his fortune, cash handed over in the dark to friends and associates who understood, without being told, that this was final. That whatever Frank was about to do, there was no version of it that included coming back. Reggie Collins, a drug dealer who ran in Frank's orbit, was one of the last people on earth to see him. The memory stayed with Collins the way certain memories do, frozen in detail. Preserved by the knowledge that what you were watching mattered more than you realized at the time. It was 4 a.m, Collins recalled. We were at Flaps on 119th Street. Frank said he was heading out of town and not coming back. I watched him drive off in a 1972 Ford Thunderbird, black body, white top. Never saw him again. Cheryl Denise Brown, Frank's mistress, the woman who had been at his side through the final, fraying months of his empire, vanished at the same time, because she did not show up to work. She did not call anyone. She did not leave a note. One day she existed in the ordinary records of American life, an address, a phone number, a job, a name that someone somewhere would recognize. And the next day she didn't. She disappeared as completely as he did, which suggests one of 2 things. Either she went with him willingly or she didn't go at all. Both possibilities lead somewhere dark. Neither has ever been resolved. The authorities would later estimate that Frank had laundered as much as $20 million in the weeks and months before his disappearance. $20 million in 1973 currency, over $100 million in today's money. Some sources, friends, associates, people who spoke in whispers to investigators and then never spoke again, claimed he left the city with 55-gallon drums filled with cash. Industrial drums, the kind you store chemicals in, were packed with money and loaded into a vehicle in the dead of night. Whether that image is literal truth or the kind of legend that grows around a man who can no longer correct the record, it captures something essential about the scale of what Frank Matthews carried into the void with him. Not a suitcase, not a briefcase, but drums. By the time the courtroom realized its defendant was not coming, it was already too late. By the time the phone calls were made and the warrants were issued and the machinery of American law enforcement lurched into action, Frank Matthews was somewhere else, or nowhere, or everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, which is the particular trick of a man who has enough money to become anyone and enough discipline to stop being himself. The DEA declared him a fugitive and launched the biggest manhunt in the agency's history. A $20,000 reward was posted, the highest bounty offered for a fugitive since the Bureau of Investigation put a price on John Dillinger's head in 1934. Thousands of wanted posters were printed and distributed across the country, each one bearing the face of a man who was already reshaping that face, or so the investigators feared. Reports would later surface that Matthews had undergone cosmetic surgery to alter his features. Whether true or not, the rumor accomplished what rumors always accomplish. It made everyone a suspect and no one a certainty. Tips poured in. The phone lines lit up. Callers claimed to have spotted Frank Matthews in Rome, in Amsterdam, in the Bahamas, in Bermuda, in Algeria, in Hong Kong, in rural North Carolina, not far from the dusty streets of Durham where he was born, in Philadelphia, where he had once run numbers and cut hair, in Chicago, west in a country that didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. In a country that did, he was everywhere. He was nowhere. Every lead was followed. Every sighting was investigated. Every thread was pulled to its end. And at the end of every thread was the same thing. Nothing. Glenn Chisholm, one of the lead investigators assigned to the manhunt, would later describe the experience in terms that sound less like law enforcement and more like chasing fog. It was the biggest manhunt in DEA history, Chisholm recalled, so it was exciting to be a part of the team, but it was frustrating as well. It looked as if we had mountains of evidence, but as we moved forward, the leads seemed to vanish into thin air. Mountains of evidence, vanishing into thin air. That is not the language of a man describing a failed investigation. It is the language of a man describing something closer to a magic trick, a performance in which the audience watches every move and still cannot explain what happened. Because here is what Frank Matthews actually did, stripped of legend and rumor, and the 50 years of silence that followed. He was facing a life sentence. He had the money. He had the connections. He had a woman who would go with him. And on the night before the world was supposed to close its fist around him, he opened his hand and let everything go. His empire, his city, his children, his name, his face, his past, and walked into a darkness that has never given him back. No gunfight, no car chase, no dramatic standoff on a rooftop. Just a man, a Ford Thunderbird, a woman beside him, and then silence. The kind of silence that lasts 50 years and counting. What follows a disappearance is not drama, it is not action, it is something far worse. It is the long, grinding, humiliating work of looking for a man who does not want to be found in a world that is very large and very indifferent to your search. The DEA's investigation group, the team assembled specifically to locate Frank Matthews after his vanishing, spent months chasing leads across the United States and overseas. They followed every tip. They investigated every sighting. They traveled to cities and countries on threads so thin they dissolved the moment anyone pulled. And at the end of it all, they had nothing. Not a credible location. Not a confirmed sighting. Not a single piece of evidence that moved the needle from where it had been on July 3rd, 1973, the day Frank Matthews was declared a fugitive. The group was disbanded. Glenn Chisholm, one of its lead investigators, recalled the ending with the kind of flatness that only deep frustration can produce. We felt like we had wasted our time and had gotten nowhere. The DEA didn't have its act together. The case was handed to the United States Marshal Service, which started over from scratch. A new team, new eyes, the same vast emptiness where Frank Matthews used to be. Deputy Mike Peaksey led the effort. He and his people did not tread lightly. They pursued and harassed everyone they believed had known Matthews or had been in contact with him. Friends, associates, family members, acquaintances, people who might have once stood in the same room as him at a party in 1971. All of them were visited, questioned, pressured, and visited again. Some moved, changed addresses, changed cities, tried to put distance between themselves and the men with badges who kept showing up at their doors. Others simply grew used to it. The marshals became a recurring inconvenience, like a bill that arrives every month for a debt you didn't incur. Nobody talked, or if they did, they said nothing useful. So Dave Flitty, another marshal on the case, remembered the interviews with grim clarity. We asked someone, "Did you see Frank?" They'd try to play us. They'd say, "Got some money, brother?" I'll tell you, we concluded that nobody we talked to knew anything, and that Frank Matthews was no longer in New York City. But it wasn't just that people didn't know. Some of them did know, or at least they knew something, and they chose silence anyway. One interviewee put it simply, "Owing with a loyalty that no badge could crack. If I knew where Frank was, I wouldn't tell you." Frank was generous with his money. Generous with his money. Think about what that means in the context of a manhunt. It means that Frank Matthews had built not just an empire, but something rarer and harder to dismantle. Goodwill. He had given enough, helped enough, been loyal enough to the people in his orbit that even years after his disappearance, when even under the direct pressure of federal law enforcement, they would rather lie to the government than betray a ghost. The investigators turned their attention to the family Frank had left behind. He had 3 sons. One of them was in prison for stealing cars. This detail stopped the marshals cold. Mike Peaksey could not make it make sense. If Matthews had $20 million when he left and he was still alive, what was his son doing stealing cars? I didn't feel that Frank had reached out to his family since he disappeared. The math was brutal. A man with $100 million fortune in today's money, and his child is committing petty crimes to survive. Either Frank Matthews was dead, and the money had died with him, or he was alive, and he had made the coldest calculation a father can make, that the safety of his escape required the complete abandonment of his children. They found Barbara Hinton, Frank's ex-wife, at a liquor store she owned, sparsely stocked, struggling. Not the kind of place that suggested a hidden line of support from a fugitive millionaire. Al Parrish, one of the investigators, left the interview with more questions than he'd arrived with. It did not seem that Hinton had any recent contact with Matthews. What kind of man leaves his kids and doesn't show up again? Surely if he was alive, he'd have stayed in contact with Barbara for the sake of the kids. I just didn't get it. Nobody got it, because the two explanations were equally terrible. Either Frank Matthews had abandoned his children to save himself, or someone had taken Frank Matthews away from his children permanently. There was no comfortable answer. There never would be. And so the theories grew, the way theories always grow in the absence of facts, like vines covering a building that nobody maintains anymore. Theory 1, he is alive. Many of the agents who worked the case believed it then, and when some believe it still. Frank Matthews was brilliant. He was disciplined when discipline was required. He had more than enough money to purchase a new identity, a new face, a new life in any country willing to accept a man who paid cash and asked no questions. The agents who hunted him understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly how capable he was. As one put it unequivocally, I think he's alive. He's a smart person. Theory 2, the Italian Mafia killed him. Paul Castellano had wanted him dead for years. The Genovese family had unfinished business after the kidnapping. A fugitive on the run, stripped of his organization and his soldiers, carrying $20 million in cash, was not a hard target. He was a gift. Seth Ferranti, an author who studied Matthews' life, subscribed to this theory. Frank's organization was in shambles, and he was on the run from the feds. He didn't have the muscle he once had. It was easier for the mob to move on him. Frank is sleeping with the fishes somewhere. Theory 3, the Corsicans and the CIA eliminated him. This one runs deeper and darker than the others. During the wiretap period, Matthews had been recorded discussing details of the Corsican drug trafficking network in Venezuela, information that subsequently helped authorities dismantle the operation, costing the Corsicans millions and disrupting what was believed to be CIA-connected activity in the region. He had two of the most powerful and least accountable organizations on earth, both with motive, both with the means to make a man and a woman disappear without leaving a trace. Gerard Miller, the veteran agent who had led Group 12, eventually came around to this possibility, put $10 or $20 million in cash in Matthews' hands, and I could see him headed for a hole in the ground without his money and with Brown right next to him. Matthews was no longer an asset. As a fugitive, he was a liability. Theory 4, he died on his own terms. A cocaine overdose in a foreign country, heart failure in a rented room, a quiet, private death, far from the spotlight and the sirens, his body buried where no one would ever think to look. Given his addiction, given his irregular heartbeat, given the strain of a life lived in permanent hiding, it is not implausible. It is in some ways the saddest possibility of all. No fingerprints have ever been found. No body, no bones. No dental records matched. No confirmed sighting in over half a century. Cheryl Denise Brown is also gone. Never seen, never heard from, never recovered. U.S. Marshal Deborah Nightingale, who worked the case around the clock for years, eventually arrived at the conclusion that exhaustion and honesty sometimes produce in equal measure. The Matthews investigation was the most frustrating case I ever worked. I literally worked the case 24/7. I followed through on every lead. By the end of the assignment, I began thinking that maybe the reason I didn't find anything solid was because Frank Matthews was dead. Maybe. That word carries the weight of the entire story. Not certainly, not probably, maybe. Because here's the truth that 50 years of searching has produced. Nobody knows. Not the DEA, not the marshals, not Interpol, not the Mafia, not the people who loved him, and not the people who wanted him dead. Frank Larry Matthews walked out of a Brooklyn night in the summer of 1973 with a woman and a fortune, and the world has been guessing ever since. He was born with nothing, a dead mother, an absent father, the poorest street in a tobacco town in North Carolina. He built a $300 million empire before his 30th birthday. He defied the mafia. He outran the federal government. He organized summits of kingpins. He lived across the street from a future godfather and smiled about it. Walking then, when the game was finally up, when the cell door was close enough to feel, he did the one thing that no gangster in the history of American crime has ever done. He left, and he stayed left. Was it the greatest escape in criminal history? The masterstroke of a man who always thought 3 moves ahead? Or was it the most elaborate burial, a body in a ditch somewhere, stripped of its money and its identity, while the legend grew around the silence? Nobody knows. And if you go to Durham today, to the narrow streets where a fatherless boy once watched black men build empires under segregation and decided he would build one too, and if you ask the old-timers what they think happened to Frank Matthews, you will not get an answer. You will get a look, a pause, the kind of silence that is not empty but full of memory, full of loyalty, full of something that might be pride and might be fear and might be both at once. Because the people of Durham have always understood something about Frank Matthews that the federal government never could. Some men are not meant to be found. I'll see you in the next one.